Did you just get a serger and realize, wait, it can't backstitch? Or maybe you've been serging for a while, but those darn thread tails still trip you up. No worries, I've got 5 techniques to help finish them off like a pro. Hi Sewing Bees, I'm Sookie, and after 25 years of teaching sergers, I have helped thousands of sewists master those tricky thread tails, and in today's video, I'm sharing 5 easy ways to handle them. So good, you'll wonder why no one ever told you sooner. Now, a quick note. If your thread tail gets tucked into another seam or a hem, you don't need to do anything special. The techniques I'm sharing today are specifically for those that are exposing the thread tails, especially those overlock tails that stay visible after stitching. I'll be demonstrating these techniques using a 4-thread overlock stitch, but the great news, they work with most overlock stitches. Just keep in mind that your results may vary depending on the thread type and the stitch width. Okay, are you ready? These techniques have been around forever, but I couldn't resist. I gave them my own cute little names. So here goes. I've got the seal and snip, the divide and tie, hidden tail, tail trap, and the stitch flip and stitch method. Let's start with the seal and snip. Hands down, the quickest way to finish a seam. For this technique, you will need a seam sealant. But let's be real. Just like your favorite pink Estee Lauder lipstick shade gets discontinued, so do seam sealant brands. So to keep things nice and simple, today I will be using Fray Check, since it's the most widely available seam sealant. Now, a quick heads up. Fray Check is essentially liquid plastic, made from nylon dissolved in an alcohol base. So once it dries, it does its job sealing those thread tails, but it can sometimes feel like a little crispy, like bacon, or even look slightly white on darker fabrics. That's just the nature of the product, so keep that in mind when you're choosing the right seam sealant for your project. To do the seal and snip, at the end of your stitch, leave at least a 1-inch thread tail. Flip your material to the wrong side, slip a piece of paper underneath to protect your table, and add the tiniest dot of seam sealant right where the threads meet the fabric. Let it dry, trim the threads, and that's it, sealed and secure. Now be sure to check the instructions on your specific seam sealant because some recommend waiting 24 hours before trimming, while others specify a drying time before washing. Now Fray Check dries pretty quickly, but it does have a habit of coming out a little too quickly for my taste. So a good hack is putting some on a paper plate and using a small paintbrush to apply. This gives better control and it prevents any accidental overflow. Next up is the divide and tie. All you need are your thread snips and about 30 seconds. Oh, and you need to know how to tie a double knot. When you're finished stitching, leave a nice long thread tail, about 3 to 4 inches. Divide the threads into 2 groups, separating the needle threads from your looper threads. Then tie them together with a quick double knot and trim them close. By the way, this one's perfect for when you're working with those gorgeous decorative threads and you want everything to look nice and crisp and professional, and you might even be afraid that the seam is going to open up for whatever reason. And by the way, these techniques are pretty cool, so you might want to take some notes. Or better yet, grab a copy of my free Hello Serger mini handbook. It's packed with serger tips and space for you to take notes. You can find the link for it in the description. Now for one of my absolute favorites, the hidden tail. This technique is like a magic trick with your thread tails. For this, you'll need either a double-eye needle, an upholstery needle, or a handy little gadget called the little hookie. I usually reach for my double-eye needle, but don't go out shopping just yet. Dig through your sewing stash first. You might already have exactly what you need. But for this demo, I will be using the double-eye needle. For this technique, you'll need a nice long thread tail, at least 2 to 3 inches, but maybe longer depending on the thread type. It's better to have it too long than too short. Now there are 2 ways to do the hidden tail technique. For both, turn your materials to the wrong side facing out. For the first way, feed the double-eye needle under the wrong side of the stitching. Do this from the inside of the stitch towards the outside. Feed the thread tails into the eye Then gently pull the thread tails under the wrong side of the stitching towards the inside of the seam. You can either clip the thread tails there or place a dot of seam sealant on it. Let it dry, then clip the thread tails. The second is to feed the thread tails into the eye of the needle. Then feed the other side of the double eye needle under the wrong side of the stitching towards the inside of the seam. Then, just like the first way, clip the thread tails or use seam sealant. Let it dry, then clip the thread tails. No matter which method you choose, here are a few key things to keep in mind. Keep the thread tails flat on the wrong side to maintain a smooth finish, and avoid tucking the ends, as that can cause warping. Feed in as much or as little as you need. Hey, if it looks good with just an inch, go for it. That's how you're going to get the most clean and professional finish. Now on to the tail trap. This technique is a garment industry favorite because it securely locks the thread tails inside the seam, preventing unraveling, and it allows the stitcher to keep moving fast. But here's the difference though. In the industry, seam allowances are typically 1/4 of an inch to cut down on fabric cost. However, in the home sewing market, we usually work with 1/2 of an inch to a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So today, I'll demonstrate this assuming you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance and will be trimming 1/4 of an inch off with your blade. But as always, feel free to adjust as needed. At the very edge of your fabric, mark and cut 1/4 of an inch wide by 2 inches. We are essentially cutting the material the blade would, but so that it lays flat. I call this the landing zone. If you've seen my previous video on starting and stopping serger seams, you'll recognize this trick. Just like before, this little cutout prevents fabric from bunching up at the start, and it lets you place your fabric directly under the presser foot without any struggle. Before positioning your fabric, make sure you have a nice long thread tail, about 5 to 6 inches. Raise the presser foot and pull the thread tail towards the front of the machine, towards you. Now, keeping your seam allowance in mind, place your fabric under the presser foot, just before the needles. Make sure the fabric completely covers the thread tail. That's the key. We're stitching directly over this thread tail, and we're permanently locking it into place. Now, once everything's in position, lower the presser foot, double check that everything is nice and flat, and start serging. Hold on to the thread tail, keeping it straight in front of you as you go. After stitching about 2 to 3 inches, gently guide the thread tail towards the blade, letting it get trimmed and fully secured in the seam. This method gives you a clean, professional finish that holds up to frequent wear and washing. Just keep an eye on your stitch fingers and seam allowance to keep everything smooth and even. Last but definitely not least, the stitch flip and stitch method, a technique that gives your seams a clean, professional finish. The best part, you don't need to worry about seam allowance. Why? Because by the time you use this technique, you've already trimmed the seam allowance off. That makes this perfect for finishing the very end of a seam, especially on a corner. Let me walk you through how it works and what to be careful of. Let's say you're finishing a corner seam where one side is already stitched and now you're working on the second side. Once you've taken your last stitch in the material, take one more stitch off the edge. Now you can do this with your hand wheel. Then raise the presser foot and the needles. Gently remove the fabric from the stitch fingers toward the back, but be careful not to pull the thread tails too far back, or you'll create loose loops. Flip the fabric to the wrong side with the front edge now facing you. Position the fabric directly under the needles. Use your hand wheel to sink the needles gently, aligning them perfectly over the previous stitches. You might want to pull out your precision angled tweezers for this to help lay that material down at the corner. Make sure that that corner is nice and flat and that there are no loopy threads. If your blade can easily be removed, you might want to move it out of the way. We want to preserve those beautiful existing stitches. If your blade does not move easily out of the way, just be really careful not to cut them. Lower the presser foot and with your hand wheel, sew a couple of stitches, making sure everything is laying nice and flat. Once you've stitched, raise the foot, raise the needles, and gently pull the fabric towards the back to remove it from the stitch fingers. Trim the thread tails close. And just like that, you've secured your seam without needing seam sealant. This is as close to a backstitch as you will ever get on a serger. Oh, and if you removed your blade, don't forget to put it back before your next project. Now, if you need a little refresher on starting and stopping your stitches perfectly, check out this video right here. And until I see you next time, I hope you have a creative day. Bye-bye.